For generations, Native American oral traditions described something buried beneath the Mississippi River Valley, not metaphorically, but literally. Structures, objects, and evidence of a civilization so old that even their own elders couldn't name it. Then archaeologists started digging. What they found didn't contradict those stories, it confirmed them. What the oral traditions described wasn't vague. They weren't speaking in symbols or allegory about spirits beneath the water. They were describing a place, a real, physical city, that once stood at the confluence of the Mississippi and Missouri rivers, a settlement so vast it would have dwarfed every European city of its era. Archaeologists call it Cahokia. At its peak, around 900 years ago, Cahokia was home to an estimated 10,000 to 20,000 people living within its central precinct, with perhaps as many again in the surrounding settlements. That made it larger than London at the same moment in history. Let that land. While medieval Europe was crowded into walled towns of a few thousand, a civilization in what is now southern Illinois had already built a metropolis, a grid, a ceremonial district, and a pyramid larger than any structure the Aztecs would raise for another 3 centuries. That pyramid, Monk's Mound, still exists. It stands roughly 30 meters tall, covers more ground at its base than the Great Pyramid of Giza, and was constructed entirely by hand, one basket of earth at a time, over the course of generations. No wheels, no draft animals, just human labor, organized at a scale that shouldn't have been possible without the kind of centralized authority and civic planning that most historians, until very recently, refused to credit to pre-Columbian North America. And here is where the oral traditions become impossible to dismiss. Multiple indigenous nations, Osage, Chickasaw, and others with ancestral ties to the region, preserved accounts of a great city near the rivers, of mounds built by their ancestors, of a civilization that collapsed under pressures they described in terms of drought, conflict, and something like political fracture. For centuries, those accounts were categorized as myth. Researchers filed them under folklore, not history. Then the soil cores came back. Then the pollen samples. Then the radiocarbon dates. And every single one of them aligned with what the oral traditions had been saying all along, that something enormous had been built there, had flourished, and had fallen. The stories were the record. Science just finally caught up. But here is what took another generation of researchers to fully reckon with. Cahokia didn't just appear. The oral traditions didn't only describe the city at its height. Several of them described what came before it. A longer, slower accumulation of people and knowledge along the river corridor, communities that had been building toward something for centuries before the mounds rose. Archaeologists once treated that idea as poetic exaggeration. Then the excavations beneath Cahokia's outermost precincts began turning up evidence of earlier settlements, layered directly beneath the later construction, carbon dated to hundreds of years before the city's peak. The city hadn't been founded, it had been grown, the way a tree grows from a root system that was already there. That distinction matters more than it might seem, because it changes what kind of civilization this was. A city that appears suddenly suggests a single founding event, a leader, a migration, a moment of decision. A city that grows over centuries suggests something more durable, a shared cosmology, a set of agreements about how to organize land and labor and meaning, passed down and refined across generations. The Mississippian culture that built Cahokia wasn't improvising. The alignment of Monk's Mound with solar and lunar cycles, confirmed by researchers studying the site's geometry, suggests a civilization that had been watching the sky long enough to build a city around what it saw. That kind of knowledge doesn't accumulate in a generation. It accumulates in exactly the way oral traditions work, carefully, deliberately from elder to child across centuries. Which raises a question that the excavations alone cannot answer. If this civilization was sophisticated enough to track celestial cycles, plan a city larger than medieval London, and sustain a population of tens of thousands, what happened to all of it? Not just the people, but the knowledge, the records, the institutional memory. The oral traditions have something to say about that too. And what they describe isn't a mystery at all. It's a warning. The oral traditions described a warning, not a mystery. Does that framing change how you think about what collapsed here? Was it something they couldn't prevent, or something they saw coming and couldn't stop? Drop your answer in the comments below. Because what those traditions actually preserved about the collapse is stranger than anything the excavations have turned up so far. The oral traditions described a warning, and the science, when researchers finally placed both bodies of evidence in the same room, confirmed exactly what that warning was pointing at. The convergence took decades to fully document. The oral traditions of nations with ancestral ties to the Cahokia region, accounts preserved across generations of deliberate, careful transmission, described a civilization that didn't simply vanish. They described one that fractured, drought, conflict, political collapse, a slow unraveling that the people living through it could feel before it completed. For a long time, archaeologists treated those accounts as metaphor. Useful color, perhaps, but not data. Then the sediment cores came back from Horseshoe Lake in Collinsville, Illinois, an oxbow lake sitting directly within the footprint of Greater Cahokia. Researchers extracted a 1,600-year oxygen isotope record from those lake sediments, and what it showed was that strongly evaporative conditions, meaning severe, persistent drought, were present from roughly 1200 to 1400 CE, precisely the period leading into Cahokia's abandonment. That is not a rough correlation. That is the oral tradition and the geochemical record describing the same collapse from two entirely different directions, landing on the same centuries. After 1200 CE, social change and population decentralization occurred at Cahokia. Archaeological evidence shows the construction of palisade walls around the city's central precinct, and skeletal trauma patterns on human remains from the broader region indicate elevated levels of interpersonal violence and warfare. Drought, conflict, political fracture. The oral traditions named all three. The bones and the lake sediment confirmed all three. Archaeologist Robert Kelly of the University of Wyoming led a team that studied this period using a database of roughly 100,000 radiocarbon dates from across the United States, tracking population movements and demographic decline during an era marked by drought, warfare, and disease. 100,000 radiocarbon dates, and they kept finding what the oral traditions had already mapped. This is the institutional silence that deserves examination, not as conspiracy, but as a genuine puzzle. The surveys existed, the traditions had been recorded, and yet, for most of the 20th century, the two bodies of knowledge sat in separate rooms. One filed under science, one filed under folklore, even when they were describing the same drought, the same walls, the same abandonment. That silence isn't the end of the mystery. It is the beginning of a much larger one, because Cahokia was not an isolated event. It was a node in something far bigger, a network of earthwork civilizations, trade routes, and oral traditions that stretch the entire length of the river system. And some of those traditions are older than Cahokia by thousands of years. The sediment cores that confirmed Cahokia's collapse pointed north, and the thread running north is older than Cahokia by millennia. The old copper culture of the upper Mississippi and Great Lakes region emerged at least 9,500 years ago and peaked between 7,000 and 5,000 years ago. That makes it at least as old as, and perhaps older than, copper-working cultures documented in the Middle East. The Mississippi Basin wasn't downstream from civilization. In some measurable sense, it was the origin of one. Great Lakes peoples of the Archaic period located 99% pure copper near Lake Superior, in veins touching the surface and in nuggets from gravel beds, with major quarries on Isle Royale, the Keweenaw Peninsula, and the Brule River. These weren't small operations. Estimates of the total copper extracted from this region before European contact run into the hundreds of millions of pounds, a volume that rivals the output of documented Bronze Age civilizations in the Old World. The difference is that the Old World Bronze Age made it into the textbooks. This one, somehow, did not. Copper from Isle Royale has been recovered from burial sites in what is now Louisiana, in Georgia, in New York. The Mississippi River wasn't just a waterway. It was the artery of a trade network that stretched the length of a continent, moving material from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico for thousands of years before anyone in Europe had named it. Great Lakes nations, Ojibwe among them, preserved accounts of a people who worked the copper before them, a civilization of copper workers described as ancient even within their own historical memory, a people who came before. Those traditions weren't recorded as history by Western institutions. They were filed, again, under mythology. Many archaeologists now suspect that a significant portion of ancient copperwork remains undiscovered in unexcavated sites, buried ceremonial caches, submerged landscapes, and settlements that still haven't been investigated. multiple unconnected nations, separated by hundreds of miles and centuries of oral transmission, describe the same buried world beneath the same river system. And the physical record keeps finding things in precisely the places those traditions pointed. If the oral traditions were right about what was buried, what else have we been calling mythology that is actually memory? Every body section so far has ended on the same unresolved edge. The oral traditions knew, the physical record confirmed, and yet the two bodies of evidence spent most of the 20th century filed in separate rooms. That separation wasn't accidental, and it isn't fully over. The researchers who have pushed hardest for systematic underwater and deep sediment surveying of the Mississippi Basin, scientists calling for coordinated sonar mapping of submerged Pleistocene landscapes, for deep core sampling beneath the river's active channel, for the kind of large-scale archaeological investment that has been applied to the North Sea and the Persian Gulf, have largely been working without the institutional backing those projects require. The funding hasn't followed, not because the questions aren't serious, but because the field hasn't quite decided whether it wants the answers. That is not a conspiracy. It is something quieter and in some ways stranger. It is a discipline that has spent generations building a timeline of North American prehistory, and that now faces evidence suggesting the timeline is incomplete in ways that would require significant revision. Revising a timeline is not a small thing. It means revisiting conclusions, reclassifying collections, reopening questions that were considered settled. Institutions move slowly through that kind of reckoning even when the evidence is clear. And here, the evidence is not yet complete, which makes the slowness easier to justify and harder to examine honestly. The hook for this entire story was a simple convergence. Oral traditions described something buried beneath the Mississippi, and archaeology kept finding it. That convergence has held across every layer of evidence examined here: the mounds, the sediment cores, the copper networks, the collapse, the trade routes. The traditions weren't approximate. They were specific. They named the drought. They named the conflict. They named the copper workers who came before. And they pointed consistently toward a pre-contact North American history that is older, larger, and more organized than the standard account has been willing to accommodate. The people who lived on this river for thousands of years described what was beneath it. We are only now beginning to confirm they were right. No one has yet looked at all of it. And that absence, that refusal or inability to look, is itself the most important finding. Subscribe if you want more history that didn't make it into the textbooks, and watch this one next.